So thanks for being here. As is our custom, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'll do that now and ask you to think carefully about the generations that came before us and the generations that will come after us, and why the work of the Alberta Wilderness Association is so important in our work and in the legacy to come. Acknowledgement of the land is a traditional custom of Indigenous people when welcoming others to their lands and into their homes. And so acknowledging the land honors the original people of the territory. This evening, I am privileged to be speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Narragansett people here in Massachusetts. Those in Calgary are on the traditional territories that have been home to many Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. This evening, we welcome you from this place called Mohkinstsis, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the Métis Region 3. We acknowledge these peoples who have lived, worked, and played and stewarded this land. We honor and celebrate these lands, and we also acknowledge the traditional lands from wherever you may be joining us today. Thank you, and thank you again for joining us tonight for the Martha Kostuch Lecture.
So good evening, everybody. Tonight's marks the 22nd time that I have stood here at this podium before you in this role of introducing this evening's events and its special lecture. Christiane Olsen and I are with you here once again. We're a little bit older, a little bit more worse for wear. And we are two of the three people who, along with AWA's then president, Peter Sherrington, who organized this annual awards night to honor those who have made outstanding contributions to the AWA, and not just to the AWA, but to conservation and environmentalism in the province, and to set up the distinguished lecture that accompanies this night. Each year, it's a very hard task for us to make award selections from so many Albertans who really deserve recognition for their roles they have played in conservation and land protection. There's a whole wall of people that we've recognized since the year 2000. And we'll add two more to that wall of fame tonight. A distinguished lecture, as I said, was accompanied these awards each year, and it came to bear the name of Martha Kostuch. And Cliff Wallace will bring more attention to this in a little bit. But she was one of Alberta's most tenacious and capable environmental leaders. Later, too, we added another award to this evening to recognize an AWA volunteer who has made an outstanding contribution to the organization. This is not necessarily an annual award. However, tonight it has a recipient, and you will soon meet that recipient who's with us live. It seems our annual awards event has morphed into a permanently hybrid event with both Zoom and live components. This year we have a larger live component than since before COVID days. And our distinguished lecture will come from you to you tonight from a remote part of Canada, something that Zoom has also made possible for us. And providing the weather gods cooperate and Sean is able to bring everything together, we will hear a lecture from the end of the world, Portugal South, Newfoundland. Of course, the main advantages of being here in person are the real food, the real wine, the real conversations that's possible with perhaps some tiresome and increasingly geriatric hosts. That's Christiane and me, of course. So thanks everyone for attending tonight. Please join us as we are about to celebrate the addition of two more long-serving, knowledgeable, well-deserving of recognition persons to our Wall of Fame. One person being awarded tonight has gone about her volunteer work in quiet but doggedly dignified fashion. The other seems to have torn through Alberta more like a tornado of energy. Both their stories will appear or have appeared in the Wildland Advocate, so don't miss them. So the whirlwind that I mentioned earlier is tonight's distinguished lecturer, Dr. Richard Thomas. And he's coming to you live, as I said, from the tip of the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland. So why is it that Alberta Wilderness Association is awarding a fish-kissing, iceberg-hugging Newfie? Naughty, naughty. If you had read this fall issue of Wildland Advocates and my article in there, you would know. And you would probably know why Richard is proudly holding up a book. And this book is on Mistaken Point. And it is the nomination document for World Heritage and UNESCO World Heritage Site status listing. And you can see that he's grinning in this photo. So you also probably can tell that he must have achieved his goal of having Mistaken Point become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was a monumental, nail-biting, cliff-hanging effort that took nearly 10 years. But Richard will tell you about all this. I won't describe it further. Incidentally, Mistaken Point, way down at the tip of the Avalon Peninsula, and its 565 million year old Ediacaran fossils, which are the oldest fossil multicellular organisms in the world, have just joined with Grossmore National Park in Newfoundland and with Alberta's Dinosaur Provincial Park and BC's Burgess Shales that we are more familiar with. These are all UNESCO World Heritage Sites already, but they've also just been recognized by the International Union of Geological Sciences as among the most important geological sites in the world. So Canada has, I think, about 6 of these sites. So just mentioned 4 of them, 2 in Newfoundland, 1 in Alberta, 1 in BC. I'm one of the few who has been privileged to visit Mistaken Point, although Christiane has also braved the elements to see it years before I did. And Dan, her husband, who's here tonight, they visited before I did. My visit was on June 14th. And I nearly froze to death walking the 3 kilometers or so to Mistaken Point, which you have to do with a guided trip fashion. You have to book ahead. And once you get to the site, you also then have to, freezing cold, take your boots off to walk across the Ediacaran fossils in your socks. And they are really something to see. There's no doubt about it. It's really a worthwhile thing to do. Once you're done, we had to walk back in the howling wind with a spitting rain coming at us. And then all this set me up for a nice evening with Richard in his cozy little fisherman's cottage at Portugal Cove, where we spent long hours reminiscing about old days back in Alberta. And Richard's long association with the AWA. And that association dates back into the early 1980s when he came from Britain via 2 years of postdoctoral fellowship at Oklahoma to join the geology department at the University of Calgary as a sedimentologist. He had grown up in Wales, in the wilds of Wales, and decided early as a child that his career would have to keep him outdoors. So he decided geology would be the career for him. And so he went to Bristol University, where he gained his PhD. But there he was exposed to ecology through things like the Club of Rome's publications and books like Silent Spring. He vowed he was not going to put his geological knowledge to the benefit of mining or fossil fuel production. He'd studied river deposits ancient pollen and plant spores and obscure things like Ediacaran fossils. All good stuff for teaching courses in sediments, but at USC, Richard allowed his ecological interests to grow, and he became involved with a radical element, Alberta environmentalism, and groups like the AWA. Cliff got him involved in fighting the Old Man Dam. He began to see a lot of ecological injustices in Alberta, especially in how its forests and their bird life were being treated by governments and industry. You should see it here now, Richard. He soon found himself a thorn in the side of the more industry supportive and more staid members of the geology department, and so they gave him the boot, less than 10 years after hiring him. This served to kick him straight into the clutches of conservationists and climate thinkers, where although poor, he came into his element. He became a writer, a researcher, a bird defender, a forest protectionist, and a darn good public speaker. He was radicalized by green elements. He rallied people. He did a long march from Calgary to Edmonton to protest Alberta being carved up as fodder for foreign pulp mills. He showed Albertans how to protest with signs at political meetings. Despite being blacklisted by the Alberta government, he had talents that they recognized and repeatedly hired him to draw up plans for Lakeland Provincial Park, for example, to write bird guides, for example, to produce documents for the Special Places program. He even joined AWA as a board member for a year. It was that year when Richard approached the board with one of his radical ideas that he demonstrated using a disgustingly dirty hanky, slammed onto the boardroom table, pulled across the table, but it resulted in AWA commissioning a painting by a prominent Calgary artist, Joyce Hall, that we've used for the basis of a poster and a whole campaign called Stop the Ripoff. I want to bring out Richard's painting, the one that he inspired Joyce to paint, because this is the original. And some of you may remember the posters that we did from it, but you could see the dirty hanky being pulled up by the feller buncher and pulling the natural part of Alberta away and exposing the industrial elements. You should see it now, Richard. I think what I'm trying to do is to introduce Richard as a complex, talented, dedicated to nature person who refused to be constrained by authorities and subjugated in any way. He left Alberta because he could take no more of the conservative agenda that wasted its advantages and treated the environment as unimportant and expendable, as a place for rotting your ATV. After a year of roaming the world's shores, indulging in viewing shorebirds in settings Arctic to tropical, he returned to Calgary in 2007. He was out of work, he was out of savings, but he attended a public library posting for jobs, and something drew his attention. There was a geologist needed in Newfoundland, and that geologist, they required a knowledge of Ediacaran fossils. But, and this is a big but, the posting expired the next day. However, was there ever a more qualified person anywhere in the world? I guess you know the answer. So with that, we will now award Richard with his outrageous photo, the photo of him being totally outraged. He's standing in his beloved boreal forest, rain pouring down on him. And this is where he would really like to be even today if he could escape. So Richard, I hope you will be able to see this.
Okay, that's great. I've been looking around for this saint that Vivian's been describing. I can't find it anywhere. First ever Zoom talk, and it's the first ever award I've ever got. So I greatly appreciate being nominated for this award by the AWA, and I'm really honored to accept it. I don't know if anyone can hear me now, but I wish I could be there in person to accept the reward. Thanks very much indeed.
All right, Richard, are you ready for the big reveal? Your only award.
Yeah.
That's right. Here we go. Ta-da!
Thank you very much.
All right, Cliff. Clear the decks. Turn it over to you.
Good evening. It's great to be here. It's great to see Mary and her family. It's a great honor for me to be able to present this award to Mary. With Mary and her son's help, just like Vivian said, you will see an article in The Advocate soon. Mary was born in Minnesota, but moved to Alberta at the age of 2. Their family set up a home on the edge of a prairie coulee near Rosebud, and they were doing what we now call regenerative agriculture before it was even a term. Mary's dad loved the wide open spaces, and I think that really rubbed off on Mary. Growing up in the Depression gave her time to develop a deeper love for the prairies and its coulees. The coulees were a playground where they would ski, pick berries, love nature, especially the wildflowers. And Mary still knows where to go to find the prairie crocuses. She lived in Rockyford and Rosebud area until retirement. But our paths crossed several times over the last 4 decades, in part because of our concerns for protecting grasslands and grassland birds, and in part because of serendipity, it seems. There's many connections that we didn't even know we had until we started talking about these things. I had an inkling that Mary was special from the first time we met when Cleve Orschler, my good buddy, and I were giving presentations to the Calgary Field Naturalists, now Nature Calgary, in the early 1980s. Mary would drive in all the way with a friend from Rockyford just to hear the latest natural history talks. That interest in nature transcended everything. She preferred a nature lecture or a hike to other snowbird activities when she was down in the Palm Springs area, such as golf. Mary and I had another interesting connection. One of Mary's high school teachers at the Rosebud School was Ray Salt, the author of The First Birds of Alberta. Through our common interest in birds, Dr. Salt and his family, Cleve, and I came to be good friends, and we shared much of the same delight as Mary in knowing Ray. Ray Salt would play an outsized role in Mary's formative years in the nature arena. Birds of prey were being banded by Ray Salt in cliff nests on Mary's family's property on the Rosebud River, someplace where I've hung over on the cliffs in my lifetime looking at prairie falcon eyries and ferruginous hawk nests. Ray introduced Mary to the wonder of birds in the natural world, but it wasn't until the 1980s that environmental concerns really started to bubble up in the Rockyford area, where Mary and her husband Frank had their farm. DeKalta Oil wanted to drill wells close to Serviceberry Creek. The neighboring Kenworthys, and it's interesting the Kenworthys came up because they're working on the Rosebud racetrack issue. So they're still involved in environmental issues. And Mary and her husband objected as well. As a farm woman challenging a male-dominated industry in the early 1980s, she was a pioneer. She just wanted the industry to stop putting access roads, well sites, and pipelines on native grass. The Kenworthy property well was denied, but the other well on the Kettenbach lands was allowed. Even though she was unsuccessful on that issue, it did not deter her. In the early 2000s, Pan Canadian had plans to drill numerous wells with pipelines running across the Rosebud River and Serviceberry Creek, with not enough attention to protecting the streams or the native prairie. Mary wrote to the Energy and Utilities Board, and armed with biological studies done by Nova Gas, Mary let the companies know they couldn't push her around. That started a good hard-nosed negotiation with Pan Canadian with Mary wearing her Mother Nature hat. How did she get that term? In the 1960s, before all of that stuff took over a significant part of Mary's life, Mary was a leader with the Girl Guides of Canada. The phrase, "Here comes Mother Nature," was often heard when her Girl Guide pack saw Mary coming. She helped the girls earn their natural history or conservation badges by collecting leaves and identifying grasses and other species. Back on the farm, Mary's kids recycled newspaper, cardboard, cans, and bottles, inspiring concern for the environment before it was even trendy. Pan-Canadian eventually became part of Encana, which continued the project, and Mary and I reconnected when she brought me in to help her with some of her concerns. Even when it was 5 company reps versus Mary, Encana didn't stand a chance. Mary knew her stuff and was resolute and focused. Encana's PR man said Mary cost them lots. But it helped keep the project off the native grass and protect the streams. Ultimately, Alberta codified the avoidance of native grassland in its guidance for oil and gas development in the province. Mary went on to help in getting Nihil County to reject a golf course in the lovely Horseshoe Canyon near Drumheller, where she had some land adjoining that lovely area as well. At 86, not giving up, during the joint review panel hearings on Encana's proposal to drill over 1,200 wells in the National Wildlife Area at CFB Suffield, Mary took the Greyhound bus or another bus every day from Strathmore to Calgary to attend, and on one occasion to Medicine Hat to make a presentation on native seed. With people like Mary expressing their concerns, along with many other concerned individuals, and a great effort by the AWA and the base, Encana's proposal was rejected and deemed inappropriate in the National Wildlife Area. Who would have thought? That area remains protected from new industrial activity to this day, and we're continuing our work there with base commander on Indigenous issues and bison. Mary has always been a fierce letter writer, writing to all manner of politicians and officials in defense of nature for places like Eagle Lake. And at 97, Mary is still going strong and writing a booklet on cowboys before the fences, situated in the Rosebud Rocky Ford area. She continues to define environmental citizenship and is still being Mother Nature. Right now, she is pressing a developer and Rocky View County to protect the wetlands near her seniors' residence. A joy to be around. Mary is a great defender of her grassland heritage. She has had an impact on me, and I'm pleased that Mary is being recognized tonight. Her unrelenting ability to make a difference has helped make the prairies in Alberta a lot more respected, loved, and protected. Thank you, Mary. Will you come up and we'll unveil it? I'd like to say a few words.
I am surprised and very pleased to be presented with this award. And along the way, I've had a lot of help because what I did just came naturally. And I want to say that thank you very much for this award. And at age 97, I want to say another generation or anyone's time on their hand who enjoys beautiful Alberta has to put their shoulder to the wheel and push where people like Cliff have worked so hard to get to. And the work is not all done by a long way. And good evening. Thank you.
And we'll just come over here.
Fill your plaque. Okay.
Picture. Okay, the grand reveal. There we go. Woo-hoo! You're up on the famous wall. We've got a good representation of ladies up there.
Not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough.
If you want to get something done, ask a woman.
It's true.
So turn it back over to Christiane. Is that
So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our great gray owl for the evening. There's at least one great gray owl in the room. Please raise your hands or stand up if you are a former recognized great gray owl. Stand up. Stand up. Hines and Ed. And tonight we're adding Tako Koning to this prestigious award. It's our custom to choose 3 words. Excuse me, I'll take this off. To describe our great gray owls. But of course, there are many more words than rockhound, teacher, and advocate that we would use to recognize and describe Tako. Some of you may not know that Tako has been an important AWA volunteer for some time now, and that indeed his volunteerism includes time given years ago. I can remember Tako and his wife Henrietta volunteering and giving their generous support before they left Canada to work abroad. On returning to Canada and following retirement, Tako came in to meet the staff and talk. He wanted to become more engaged and wondered what he could do to help. In these years, he has helped when our staff needed support on issues by mentoring them and increasing AWA's effectiveness. He stepped up to help with the Big Hill Springs Preservation Society fight against gravel mining when AWA needed to lend them our support and our staff resources were limited. He is an inspiration. He is persistent and in his advocacy, and in most of all, in his untiring help for anyone who wants to learn about rocks, geology, and why knowing more about our natural world will make a difference. He has an ability to make even a road trip to look at abandoned oil wells interesting, if not intriguing, just to go along and see what he might say. Or perhaps it's the pint at the Longview Saloon at the end of the day. In his way, he defies those who believe supporters of the Adventures for Wilderness program would only want to see the best of the best in our natural world, rather than the problems we face. Tako has, for the past 3 years, made a significant contribution to AWA and the Adventures program. He's joined me on a number of interpretive hikes to help adventurers learn and enjoy a day out with us. He's known in the community for his untiring work to help others learn and become more engaged in environmental citizenship. A most worthy recipient, AWA is proud to recognize Tako Koning as a great gray owl this evening. Tako, please come forward to help me unveil the plaque that honors all our great gray owls. There we go. We got to lift this off. Help me lift it off. Yeah. The great reveal. And with any luck at all, your name is right there. And we have a couple of little things for you. There you go. And something very special wrapped up here. This is, I don't know, just because.
I'll take
Just because. I know you'll take it. You can. And indeed, I just want to let everybody know that Tako is here while his daughter is in, and Henrietta are in Montreal. His daughter's had a serious bicycle accident, but is recovering day by day.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I actually wrote out a little speech here. I would do it impromptu, but I'm just about to turn 73, and sometimes you forget things, right? So it's better to have it on paper. Yeah, right. So, anyways, so it's just just honored to be getting this award. And yeah, in actual fact, my family, we got involved with the AWA 25 years ago, believe it or not. And so my wife, Henrietta, she used to volunteer for the AWA. She wrote articles for I think it was, even then it was called the Advocate. And then she helped in the office from time to time. And then our son, his name is John Paul, he's very artistic, and he used to do cartoons for the magazine, okay? Sort of political type cartoons. And so that was 25 years ago. So in a way, we've been involved with the AWA for a quarter of a century, which is a really long time. And so anyways, my son and married a Quebecois lady when he was at McGill University, and he stayed in Montreal since that time. And he's on Zoom with the 2 grandkids. And so wherever, oh, there it is. And Celia and Pierre. So they're kind of watching this. And so, hi guys, here's Gramps. So we actually spent 30 years working overseas, and I'm a geologist by background. Incidentally, you probably wonder where I got my funny name from. Well, it's from Holland. I'm originally from Holland. So in Holland, they call me Tako. Here they call me Tako. And we live in Nigeria. They call me TK. And so at any rate, we spent 30 years living in the jungles of Sumatra. And then we came back. And then we headed off to work, got transferred to Lagos, Nigeria. And not an easy place. And we also spent time, we spent 20 years, believe it or not, in Angola, West Africa. And during that time, we were there also during the Civil War, so it was, bad. And so, anyways, but also a lot of good things, a great learning experience. And so then when you come back to a place like Canada, we came back in 2015, you really do appreciate this country for what it is. What a beautiful, safe country that we live here in Canada. We're really blessed to be living in this country. In Nigeria, we became members of the Nigeria Field Society, and enabled us to join with expats and Nigerians to travel in the countryside in Nigeria to see, interesting environmental, historical places. And so then when we moved to Angola, then my wife joined, formed what we called the Angola Field Group. And so she was the main organizer of that. And so we would take, again, expats, but a lot of Angolans, so they could discover their own country. We'd take them out in the countryside and they would see environmental projects. They would see, I showed them geological stuff, paleontological stuff. She'll be showing them stuff like birding, magnificent birding up in the highlands of Angola. We take people turtling, go along the beach and you'd see all these turtles, hatching their eggs and all sorts of stuff like that. And so we did that for 13 years and always taking groups of maybe 20, 30 people out on this, and challenging because there was in Angola, there's a big issue with landmines from this long Civil War. So when we took people on field trips, they had to be a little careful that some places there was still a big problem with the landmines. But anyways, so we managed it. And so then when we came back here in 2015, it seemed logical for us to get involved with the AWA again. And so then, I started thinking about organizing some field trips. And then this magnificent project came up, Adventures for Wilderness. And I thought, hey, I've led field trips in Africa. If you can lead field trips in Africa, you can lead field trips anywhere, including Alberta. So anyway, so then I started leading these field trips. And one of the first ones which I did was I took people south of Calgary, and we were looking at the whole issue of orphaned oil and gas wells. And so then at the same time, I joined a group called the Calgary Justice Film Festival. It used to be called the Mar de Loup Justice Film Festival. Now it's called the Calgary Justice Film Festival. And so, which is focused on justice issues, which are, you know, environmental justice and social justice issues. And it's been going on for 17 years. AWA has participated from time to time with tables. We have also kind of called a peace fair. At any rate, to make things short, I was told to keep it down to about 3 minutes. But so so again, the whole issue of orphaned oil and gas wells. So you got some poor farmer, rancher, you know, he's got this 1 or 2 or 3 gas wells, oil wells, which are sitting on his land. Maybe they're leaking a bit of gas, a little bit of oil, and he's stuck, right? And who's gonna take care of it? The oil company's gone bankrupt, and so the value of his land has gone down because of this potential safety issue. And so to me, that's a justice issue. It's not fair what happens to people like that. And so when I lead the field trips, it's not just geology, it's also, we got to look at things in terms of justice. Another part of one of my field trip is where we look at a gas plant just down south of Calgary, the Mazeppa gas plant. Okay, this is a justice issue, both environmental and justice, because this is a gas plant which was, the operator was, I won't name the company, but they made a lot of money. And then towards the end, I think they were transferring all this money maybe to the Cayman Islands or China, whatever, and skimming off all the profits. And when then they went bankrupt, and then they walked away from this gas plant at a cost. And so now the government has had to go in and clean up the mess. They got to, you know, tear down the gas plant and rehabilitate the whole area, environmentally remediate. There's groundwater issues, you know, it's a high sulfur. And so it's not fair for the neighbors for this to happen. And it's also not fair for us as taxpayers to have to pay the cost of that. And so again, to me, this is both an environmental issue and a justice issue. Another example of something like that would be, this is a field trip I plan to organize, is we're going to go down to southern Alberta and see what's happening in terms of the impact of coal exploration. So you got these companies, they say, we just want to go in there and do a bit of exploration for coal. We're not going to take out any coal. We're just exploring for it, right? So the government says, okay, it's just exploration, no big deal. But they have to have access, right? So how do they get access? Well, get bulldozers in and bulldoze a road up and down, up and down, up and down, drill some exploration wells for coal. And maybe they don't find any, or the project is not economic, so they walk away from it. In the meantime, they leave roads which you know, there's water pouring off, there's erosion, there's pollution from that running into the system. They've walked away from it. So that to me is not just an environmental issue, it's a justice issue. That is not fair, you know, for that to happen. And so then lastly, one of the field trips I put on is we go around Cochrane, the Cochrane area. And that got started by Vivian, because Vivian took a group of us to see this magnificent meltwater channel in Cochrane. And when I saw that, I thought, whoa, this could be a great field trip. But then we learned about this whole issue of gravel, and that there was going to be, Vivian brought it to my attention, that there's going to be this huge gravel mine to be located almost next door to a provincial park, and a much loved, much visited provincial park. And to me, that's not fair. That's a justice issue. That's an environmental issue. And so that's something which I bring up in my field trips. Also, I show places where I'm not anti-oil. In fact, I'm a petroleum geologist, and so oil was for a lifetime. But there's cases where they put these oil frac pads almost next to people's houses. That's not fair. If you got a house out there, you don't want to have a frac pad with nine wells going up and down, a little bit of H2S floating around, and it affects you. It affects your whole lifestyle. And so that again, so I'm not just talking about geology. In this case, it's again, it's a justice issue. So to finish off, what I'm trying to say is that that brings me back to the Alberta Wilderness Association. So it's called, Alberta Wilderness Association, but this organization is more than just about wilderness. It's about the environment and also, justice. And so I find that my priorities run parallel to what the AWA does, okay? We're running along parallel tracks. And so that's what inspires me. And so I'm about to turn 73. And as long as my health is in good shape, as long as my health is okay, then I plan to keep on doing these field trips. And so, to finish things off, I'm delighted to get this award, and I'm delighted to be associated with what I view as just an excellent organization, which is the Alberta Wilderness Association. So thank you for your recommendation for this award.
So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what this evening is all about. This lovely lady, I know she's up here, right there. Martha Kostuch. That's who this evening is named after. So every year, we host the annual Wilderness and Wildlife Lectures, and we have renowned guest speakers like Richard coming up a little bit later here. The lectures are meant to inform, challenge, and inspire, as well as further our mission of defending wild Alberta through awareness and action. The lecture honors Martha, perhaps Alberta's most persistent environmental advocate and someone I miss dearly. Martha was recognized with Alberta Emerald Foundation Awards, as well as a National Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Environmental Network, Nature Canada's Douglas Pinlet Award, and of course, our own Wilderness Defender Award. Martha was a people hugger and a tree hugger, and always a true friend of the environment. She helped create the Clean Air Strategic Alliance, one of the most effective consensus-based organizations on environmental issues in North America. She was active in many NGOs, including the AWA, the Prairie Acid Rain Coalition, Canadian and the Alberta Environmental Networks, National Air Issues Coordinating Committee, Friends of the West Country, and the Parkland Airshed Management Zone. Although expert at bringing enemies together, Martha could take on the biggest adversaries in court and win. She was instrumental in changing processes, laws, and attitudes. My proudest moment was when Martha and I took our fight over the Old Man Dam all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. With the help of our great legal team, the Piikani First Nation, and the WA support, Friends of the Old Man River won a landmark ruling that changed environmental law in Canada and asserted Canada's shared jurisdiction over the environment. Endless pressure applied endlessly. We have worn down some tough rocks. Defending nature played a huge part in bringing meaning to Martha's life. Before passing, she wrote a new vision for Alberta. It included a stable, resilient, healthy economy based on energies of the future, not those of the past. She added, we need to truly protect our wilderness, native prairies, wetlands, and rivers, not just for their beauty and recreational opportunities, but for the biological diversity and the fundamental human needs they help meet. Martha asked us to continue to defend the environment in her memory. And here at the AWA, we do that every day in our work, our volunteer work, our staff work hard on those wild spaces and the creatures that inhabit them. Many other wilderness defenders are honored on our recognition wall. They and many others who we haven't gotten around to honoring yet are the giants on whose shoulders we stand. Tonight, we also celebrate the many other wilderness defenders like Mary and Richard, who have helped us enormously in that struggle to advance environmental protection, as well as the environmental rights of all Canadians. And thank you for zooming in. We just have a little bit of a change here.
All right, well, we'll dive in. Greetings from Newfoundland. For Techno Dinosaur, giving a Zoom presentation is a bit of a strange experience, so fingers crossed we don't crash and burn. I stole my title from a a bumper sticker I saw in Maine in 1997, and it seems even more appropriate now. And I realized that when I got involved in environmental issues in Alberta, it was mostly because I was outraged at something that had gone on. And it sounds like there's still plenty to be outraged about. The warning used to appear on TV programs in Britain where I grew up. And of course, that made them absolute must viewing. AWA has asked me to talk about some of my environmental work in Alberta and Newfoundland and any lessons I might have learned along the way. I've added a little bit of stuff to that mix, including some of my hobby horses, one of which is reality, and you'll see that in a minute. And speaking of reality, I want to start by looking at some of today's realities, which are frankly pretty grim. All right, we were talking about realities. Well, our species is totally dependent for its survival on nature's services. And we're unique in the history of the world because we're the only species that's actually undercutting and destroying the basis for our very existence. So the net result of this is that we're facing a self-induced existential crisis. And the main components of that crisis are, as everybody knows, climate change. And quite frankly, the climate change deniers, the fossil fuel industry propagandists, and the politicians in their pockets have succeeded, if you can call it succeeding, in slowing down or even preventing viable action, meaningful viable action on climate change until really now it's a little too late or very late. We're in for a very hard landing in terms of climate change. Even the UN is saying that 1.5 degrees C is just not on now. And we're closely approaching some very important tipping points, such as, the release of methane from permafrost, the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, you name it. The biodiversity crisis is perhaps even more frightening. In the history of life on Earth, there have been 5 mass extinctions, and we are causing the 6th. And the key feature about this one is, in geological terms, it's happening in the blink of an eye. And we depend, as I said, on nature's services. So we're undoing the fabric of our existence, if you like. Overpopulation, well, this is really astonishing. You probably heard that on Wednesday, the UN notified the world that our population has now hit 8 billion. And it's terrifying to me that in my lifetime, the human population of the world has tripled. Bill Rees from UBC of Ecological Footprint fame calculated in the year 2000 that for a population of 6 billion, to bring them up to Canadian material standards would require 2 or 3 more Earths. Pollution, of course, is extremely important as well. And I didn't know this, but apparently humans have manufactured 350,000 chemical compounds. And we only know the safe exposure levels and the long-term health effects of about 1% of those. As usual, the burden of proof is backwards. It's up to us, the guinea pigs, to determine whether these things are dangerous or not. And it's also been calculated that by the year 2050, the volume of plastics in the ocean will exceed the volume of fish. Every one of us now contains PFAs, polyfluoroalkyls, which are called forever chemicals. These are the ones used for Teflon and stuff for non-stick surfaces. Okay, let's hope we can change the slide. Aha! Well, in his terrific book, The Unconscious Civilization, John Ralston Saul talks about the relentless positivism we're subjected to. And society these days, to me, it seems like we have a collective failure to face up to unpleasant realities. And if you acknowledge such realities or you criticize the status quo, you're treated as almost if you've committed a crime. And I've been accused of it many times. You're so negative. If you need an antidote to this sort of thing, I really recommend Barbara Ehrenreich's book, which is called Bright-Sided: How Positive Thinking is Undermining America. As they say, denial ain't just the river in Egypt. So I regard myself as a realist, and read the bottom there. The only ones who really know what's going on are realists. So let's get to Alberta. As you well know, in terms of environmental politics, it's a very surreal place. I had a folder of newspaper cuttings of the utterances of Alberta's so-called environment ministers. It was a thick folder. It could be a talk in its own right. And Ken Kowalski, Lorne Taylor, Ralph Klein, and Ty Lund, and the rest of them. It was amazing. They were always defending the fossil fuel industry or the forestry industry or whatever, and you know, basically doing down the environment. Pure Thailand is slamming the plan to sign the Kyoto deal. What's also weird about Alberta, although this is true in Newfoundland as well, there are many value-laden terms that are used, particularly by industry and government, very Orwellian terms. I'll only tackle two here. It's amazing that the oil industry in particular calls creating protected areas sterilizing the land. I have a real bee in my bonnet about the use of the term harvest, and I just go bonkers when I see this used in environmental publications. Okay, if you plant a crop, if you nurture that crop, and if you harvest that crop, yes, you're a harvester. But in Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, fishermen and fisherwomen are described as harvesters. And this is straight out of the book of Genesis and fits right in with the entitlement culture here. I think the lesson here for environmentalists is to be very careful not to adopt industry's language, because that suggests that you tacitly support their practices. In 1988, Vivian has given half my talk, I'm afraid, so there's some repetition here, but in 1988, Ken Kowalski got me outraged. Oh, whoops, I'm jumping slides here. Let's try again. In late 88, the Alberta government, with zero democratic input, signed away 15% of the province in two very large forest management agreement areas to two Japanese-owned pulp mills, Daishawa and Alberta Pacific. A lot of work was done by various environmental groups, including AWA, but in particular Friends of the Athabasca. And there were large protests in Alberta, the like of which I don't think have been seen since. But there was a federal provincial environmental review panel convened, and that toured the province to look into the impact of the Alberta Pacific pulp mill in particular. But in terms of its terms of reference, that panel could only look at the potential impacts of the pulp mill's effluent on the Athabasca River system. They weren't allowed to look at the impact of all that cutting on the boreal forest, and you know, made no sense. So for the Northern Lights Society in 1990, I proposed that we do a March for moratorium on mills, and a walk from Calgary to Edmonton to arrive in Edmonton on Earth Day. This was my first real experience of dealing with the media over environmental issues, and it was quite an eye-opener. For the photograph on the right there, the Calgary Sun photographer, in order, of course, to trivialize the whole thing, wanted me to hug a tree. So I less than politely told him no. Corporate media, when they tackle environmental issues, I mean, there's good and bad, mostly bad. This is a classic example of trivializing an extremely important environmental issue. I'll read it out. First, the bad news. The world as we know it may be coming to an end. Now for the good news. You will be able to golf to 2 more months of the year. Of course, there is good coverage, and the lesson from this one, for me, this is a cover of Time magazine, is the brilliant use of imagery. And it's very important for us in the environmental movement to make full use of imagery, as you obviously know. But this one I think is brilliant. I love cartoons, I love images. And my all-time favorite cartoon is this one, which is taken from a book called Under the Eagle by Jenny Pierce, came out in 1982. And here you have Ronald Reagan chomping down on so-called banana republics. And the book was about US intervention in Central America and the Caribbean. Absolutely brilliant. I've got a suggestion for the wildlands advocate. I would say in every issue, have a section called Signs of the Times, in which your readers submit a photograph and a caption, suitable caption. The only polite caption, this is my first one to submit, the only polite caption I can think of is, for this one is, I sincerely hope not. Well, as Vivian mentioned and showed the wonderful painting by Joyce Hall, this was my one and only foray into artistic imagery. And this one happened, this is where Ken Kowalski comes into play. I heard him on the TV saying that the Old Man Dam would improve the environment. So that ended up with me having a sleepless night, and sometime in the middle of the night, this idea popped into my head that you could have the natural skin, if you like, of the province being ripped off to reveal the industrialized landscapes beneath. And as Vivian said, when I was trying to, quote unquote, sell this idea to the AWA board, I still remember the looks on their faces when I hauled out that handkerchief. It was very funny indeed. In '92, I moved up to Lac La Biche to work as the Lakeland District Planner for Alberta Parks. And this was quite an educational experience in its own right. When I got up there, I expected to be battling the oil industry and Alberta Pacific in defense of Lakeland, but that wasn't the case. What I was doing was battling their proxies, because the main enemies of Lakeland were the province's departments of energy and forestry. So some of the things I learned up there, quote unquote, was from the forestry superintendent: the smell of pulp mills is the smell of money. From the regional director of the energy department, I learned that the ecological impacts of linear disturbances like cut lines are confined to the actual footprint of the linear disturbance. And this is, of course, absolute rubbish. And you could use a rather sick analogy by saying that the only impact of the atomic bomb is the people who are killed by the initial blast. And from the head of the Trappers Association, I learned that we have to manage the animals. They can't manage themselves, which really made me want to ask, how have they survived without us all this time? One of the disturbing things up in Lac La Biche was the quite entrenched racism that was directed towards Indigenous people up there. Well, right-wing governments have a big problem with parks and protected areas. They don't know what to do with them, really. They're an embarrassment. And as we've seen, they sterilize the land. So what tends to happen is that the government changes the name of the agency that parks belong to, and it shuffles them from department to department. This is from the CPAW's 2007 report on the state of Alberta's parks and protected areas, and shows you some of the changes. I'm not going to go through them, but exactly the same thing happens in Newfoundland. I worked for the provincial government for 9 years, and in that time had 11 different ministers. So you get a minister up to speed on Mistaken Point, and 2 minutes later they were gone. Very frustrating. Another thing that right-wing governments love to do is privatize things, particularly parks, because to a neoliberal government, parks, the natural world, excuse me, has no intrinsic value. It only becomes valuable if it makes money. What happens when privatization takes place is the quality of service usually declines and the prices increase. This sign is taken from Sir Winston Churchill Provincial Park up near Lac La Biche. And foolishly, years before, the campground had been placed in a stand of old growth forest. And when the private operator took over, the thing they first wanted to do was to enlarge the campsite so they could fit bigger RVs in them. This, of course, led to more wind throw, and any tree that leaned a few degrees from the vertical was a safety issue. So that had to come down as well. And I mean, if that continues, you're going to have this Winston Churchill Memorial Prairie. The sickening irony of all this was that the whole operation was still being subsidized by the Alberta taxpayer. Excuse me. In Newfoundland in the 1990s, a number of provincial parks and provincial recreation areas were privatized. And when I got to Newfoundland, I remember talking to a park manager who told me the story of how he visited one of the parks, one of the campgrounds he used to look after. And he knew it was subtly different, but he couldn't understand why. And eventually the penny dropped. The new campground operators had stripped all the arboreal lichens off the trees because they made the trees look untidy. Well, while I was up in Lac La Biche, I wrote and self-published this booklet called Making Connections, which is about Alberta's near-tropical migratory birds. Having seen forest destruction in Alberta and in Central America, and reading about the declines of these neotropical migratory birds, I wanted to write a sort of holistic booklet about why they were in decline and perhaps what we could do about it. And it was quite the experience. It would be a lot easier to self-publish something these days, of course. Neotropical migrants make up 60% of Alberta's avifauna, and they are the ecological connection between Alberta, mostly the boreal forest, and the tropics. And we only borrow them. They're tropical birds. We only borrow them for our summer when they come up for 3 months to breed. Alberta Wilderness Association got a grant from the Mountain Equipment Co-op to reprint this booklet, and it was sent out to all the schools and libraries in Alberta. When I was in Central America, what I saw there certainly made me think about the ecological consequences of our food choices. For example, this is Costa Rica, and here you see, I've got an arrow that works, a coffee plantation and clearance of primary rainforest for coffee plantations and for cattle ranching. This is one of Dole's big banana plantations in Costa Rica. The bunches are being pulled by a human mule who's hidden behind this stanchion. But while on the trees, the bunches are in these plastic bags, and the plastic bags are filled with fungicides. So after Costa Rica, I decided I was going to give up coffee, pineapples, and bananas. Working on making connections, the big disappointment really was realizing that a lot of birders were quite content to pursue their passion and not do anything productive in terms of working for conservation of the birds that are the focus of that passion. Fanatical birders in Britain are called twitchers, and they travel the length and breadth of the country looking for rare birds. And you can see they have tremendous economic clout. I mean, look at the number of spotting scopes, binoculars, cameras, fancy field gear. But it was clear that most birders just regard birds as ticks on their lists. And the then head of the Edmonton Bird Club told a friend of mine that I'll worry about birds declining when I can't find them anymore. This is, doubly disappointing because in the early 1900s with the formation of the Audubon Society, the National Audubon Society in the States. That was a group of bird lovers who were trying to prevent the killing of egrets, particularly snowy egrets, for their plumes for the fashion trade. Well, between 95 and 98, I was under contract to Alberta Parks. As Vivian mentioned, as part of the Special Places 2000 initiative. And I was managed by Peter Lee. It was a great experience for me, but I think I was the one who turned poor Peter's hair white. But anyway, I was tasked with looking for the best candidate protected areas in the foothills natural region, which is brown on the map, and the boreal forest natural region, which is green. I should point out here, this border between the aspen parkland and the southern dry mixed wood more or less corresponded in those days to the boundary between Alberta's green zone and white zone. But the white zone was moving northward and eating into the southern dry mixed wood mostly through clearances for agriculture. Excuse me. The approach I took to looking for best candidate protected areas was to find out basically what was left intact in each of these two regions. And I was able to do this thanks to the GIS wizardry of Duke Hunter at Parks by superimposing various disturbance layers for the natural region. So the disturbance layers would have been things like pipelines, cut lines, well sites, cut blocks, settlements, you name it. This hadn't been done before in Alberta, to the best of my knowledge. For the foothills natural region, one of the most interesting things I did was put together this series of time-lapse aerial photographs for a portion of the central Swan Hills. And I did this after having a conversation with another AWA stalwart called Brett Purdy, who suggested this idea to me. And I went looking for the photos, and these are at somewhat different scales, but the white star in each marks the same spot. Anyway, you can see with the 4 photos, it goes from 1949 through 64, 82, and 1991. And I photographed this from a poster that was put together by Joan Sherman. This type of time-lapse aerial photo sequence is really important for tackling what's now called intergenerational amnesia or shifting baseline syndrome, whereby, for example, someone who grew up in the 1991 landscape, which is a totally industrialized landscape with a lot of oil and gas activity, highly fragmented by clear cuts, wouldn't realize that the same landscape in 1949 was pretty much pristine wilderness, grizzly bear habitat. In 64, the Judy Creek oil field was discovered. You can see well sites, roads, and cut lines. And then by 82, the logging had begun. I'd love to see a time-lapse sequence for the growth of Calgary, actually, and I'd caption it the city that ate southern Alberta. In modern parlance, this sequence went viral, and in fact, it was even published in Oil Week magazine. The second report was on the boreal forest natural region, and this one engendered a great deal of controversy, mostly because it ended up on the front page of the Globe and Mail after Andrew Nikiforuk wrote an article about it. The media focused on 2 basic findings in this report. First off was the fact that I looked for genuine wilderness areas remaining in the boreal forest natural region. And these are by township, that's 6 miles by 6 miles. These are the green townships that conform to the American Wilderness Act definition. This was in 1998. And you can see that the majority of them are clustered within the red line, which of course is Wood Buffalo National Park. And the disturbing discovery was that less than 9% by township of the boreal forest natural region remained as genuine wilderness. On the left here, there's a map of linear disturbance density, with red being the densest. And you can see where there are fewer linear disturbances. That's one of the criteria used to find a more or less genuine wilderness area. I should give a shout to Mike Sawyer here as well, who generated this map. Mike was a pioneer in the mapping of linear disturbance density in Alberta. Well, the junction between the white area and the green area, or zone, I call the fragmentation frontier. And this picture was taken in 1990 near Coal Lake. And here, the predominantly aspen forest in the southern dry mixedwood is being cleared for farmland. And in those days, the trees were just bulldozed and set alight. Once Alberta Pacific came on the scene, they were paying farmers for their trees and would clear the land for them. What got controversial about this was I wanted to find out the rate of deforestation in the fragmentation frontier. So we looked at the rate of forest loss between 1949 and 1994. And it turned out that the annual rate percent was higher in the southern dry mixedwood of Alberta than in Amazonia between 1975 and 1988. Of course, the total area of forest lost in Alberta was much smaller. But the media absolutely leapt on this statistic, as you can imagine, much to the dismay of the Alberta government. And there were a number of articles about this. Of course, the usual suspects came to the government's defense, and I'll just read out the arrowed quote here, which is talking about Andrew Nikiforuk's article. It says that it was hurtful, malicious, and an insult to Albertans who have a worldwide reputation as wise stewards of their natural resources. Who knew? Well, this issue almost brings tears to my eyes. In 2002, the Energy Utilities Board held hearings into True North Energy's proposal to create an oil sands, shocking, don't use their language, a tar sands mine in the Fort Hills, their Fort Hills project. And so AWA asked me to be their representative at the hearings and speak at the hearings. This is an aerial shot of McClelland Fen, which is part of the McClelland Lake Wetland Complex. And this fen is one of the most spectacular in Canada, if not the world. As I'm sure you know, the difference between a bog and a fen is that fens have a through flow of water, and that's what generates this fabulous pattern. Incidentally, True North Energy was ultimately owned by the Koch brothers, the infamous Koch brothers in the States, only one of which is alive now, but their politics are well to the right of Attila the Hun. True North Energy wanted to mine half of McClelland Fen. Well, some of the lessons that we learned at the hearings were as follows. First of all, the outcome of the hearings was a foregone conclusion. It was pre-decided. True North Energy had spent $150 million just getting to the hearing. Second, the EUB was what is termed a captured regulator. Kevin Taft, in his book, a great book called Oil's Deep State, and I quote from it, says, Alberta is a place where the oil industry has captured such a swath of institutions for so long that democracy itself has become fossilized. I also learned that except for water and surface water and aquifers, the EUB had no interest in environmental conservation. It's not part of their mandate. conservation to the EUB meant mining every last teaspoonful of tar sands. Well, True North Energy claimed that converting half of McClelland Fen into this type of tar sands pit would still allow the other half to function normally, thanks to the working of its sustainability committee. I think Harry Potter would be proud of the magic worked by the sustainability committee if they could achieve that. Quite frankly, destroying McClelland Fen is an absolute crime. Environmentalists have got to be very careful about industry greenwashing, and the greenwashing has become an industry by itself, really. And one of the worst examples of greenwashing I've ever seen is related to the and here it's shown in Syncrude's advert, which says, "Marvel at magnificent creatures in their natural habitat." Well, these are wood bison. I emphasize the wood bison. And here they are grazing in a pasture. And you've got to be very, very careful with language, as we've discussed, because a pasture fit the government's definition of reclamation in the surface mineable area of the tar sands. And so, yes, they claim they've reclaimed it, but of course it isn't ecological restoration. Here's another one that had my blood pressure going through the roof, and AWA asked me to be its spokesperson for this issue. Around 2002, the commercial fishermen in Lac La Biche started blaming the crash of the walleye population in the lake on the increasing numbers of double-crested cormorants there. This claim was absolutely bogus. But unfortunately, the rookie MLA, Ray Daniluk, for that area, jumped on the bandwagon and led the campaign to cull the cormorants. But the interesting thing scientifically was that the double-crested cormorant increase was the effect, not the cause. Fish and Wildlife's own data showed that the crash was 100% due to overfishing. And what had happened was the walleye were fished out. That, in ecological terms, released the bait fish population from predation, and that population exploded. And of course, the cormorants, having so much more food around, their population increased in response. This had been shown by an elegant study at Lake Winnipegosis, for example. But the cormorants are scapegoats. They've been culled in Ontario, and now that's happening in Newfoundland based on the absolute flimsiest arguments. It's disgusting, really. And the lesson here, again, sad to say, is that scientific facts can be no match for misinformation and political opportunism. Well, as Vivian mentioned, in 2008, I moved to the southeastern tip of the island of Newfoundland. Here is Portugal Coast South that she mentioned. It's a community of less than 100 people now. It's an outport. And I went to work as the manager of Mistaken Point Ecological Reserve, shown here in blue, one of the world's most important fossil sites. And the move, believe it or not, from Alberta to Newfoundland was a bit like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, because here we've got a premier that talks about green oil, quite the oxymoron. We have the Muskrat Falls mega dam hydroelectric project, which is an environmental and financial disaster. And the government has invested heavily in open marine pens salmon aquaculture, which itself is an ecological disaster in the making. And here I've got to stop and plug Dr. Alexandra Morton's book, regarding her 30-year fight against salmon aquaculture in BC. The title of the book is Not on My Watch. It's a fabulous read. I mean, she is really inspiring. Well, this is Mistaken Point itself, and you can see it looks very tundra-like, and so no surprise that there are a lot of Arctic alpine plant species here. It belongs to the Eastern Hyperoceanic Barrens ecoregion. Quite a mouthful. One of the diagnostic or characteristic features of this ecoregion is that we get between 130 and 150 days of fog a year, which can get pretty tiresome. As you can see, the coastline of the reserve is very spectacular. Well, as again, Vivian alluded to, the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years old, and 88% of that time is Precambrian. And Mistaken Point belongs to the Ediacaran period, which is the youngest bit of the Precambrian. Excuse me. And the rocks in the reserve are between about 580 and 560 million years old. And Mistaken Point is the first wholly Precambrian World Heritage Site to be inscribed. Let's look at the site itself. This bedding plain is the world famous E surface at Mistaken Point, and preserved on it are over 4,000 large organisms. They're preserved as impressions. This once was a deep ocean floor. As Vivian said, it's 565 million years old, and these animals are preserved more or less in situ. And they were killed and preserved by volcanic ash, a sort of Ediacaran Pompeii. The black here is the volcanic ash. Here's a close-up of a bit of the surface, and this is an organism called Charnia discus, and this oval here was its holdfast. It would have stood upright in the current. A lot of these organisms are rangimorphs, and they have a quite unique self-similar structure. A lot of people, when they look at them, think they're ferns or they have that plant-like look, but most of them are now considered to be genuine animals. And about 20 meters above the E surface, there's one layer that contains a series of trails. This is one of the trails. And it was produced probably by a sea anemone-like organism moving very slowly across this deep ocean floor. Well, if you want your site to be a World Heritage Site, you have to convince UNESCO that it has outstanding universal value. And I'll just, as Vivian said, this is the key thing. Mistaken Point has fossils of the world's oldest and largest known architecturally complex multicellular organisms. And hence, for the application, we used the catchphrase at Mistaken Point was the place when life got big. These fossils are very important scientifically, but they're also very attractive to black market fossil collectors. And here you see a fossil that was being cut out with diamond saws by 3 American fossil thieves in 1998. But this theft was foiled by residents of Portugal Coast South. Well, the key to protecting a fossil site is controlling access. And at Mistaken Point, this is done in a number of ways. Again, as Vivian said, you have to go on an official guided tour to walk on the E and D surfaces. There's a whole permit system. You need a permit if you're doing scientific research in the reserve, if you're bringing an educational tour group there, or if you're a commercial operator, for example, making a film about the fossils. There's also a fossil protection zone, and local residents can get a permit to enter the fossil protection zone, a traditional user permit. Also, in the old days, we used to give people these rather spiffy blue bomber booties to wear before they were allowed to walk on the fossil surfaces. You have to take your footwear off. And now they get woolen socks, apparently. In 2009, as a sort of insurance policy, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, in collaboration with the Royal Ontario Museum and Oxford University and others, had a latex mold made the best part of the E-surface. And from this latex mold, a fiberglass replica of the surface, an exact replica of the surface, was created. And so if something disastrous should happen to the surface, at least scientists will have the exact replica to study. And in 2009, while we were doing the casting project, David Attenborough was there, and he was filming for his mini-series First Life, which, if you haven't seen it and you're at all interested in these sorts of fossils, is great viewing. Well, Mistaken Point was a drama queen to the very end, really. And 2 days before the decision was due from the World Heritage Committee, and the committee was meeting in Istanbul, there was that attempted coup in Turkey. But fortunately, the World Heritage Committee, before it cut the meeting short, inscribed Mistaken Point on the World Heritage list. They would have deported me, I think, if we'd failed. And now, of course, Mistaken Point has some illustrious company on the World Heritage list. And I would like to say that, you know, the management of Mistaken Point today is at World Heritage Site standard. But, and this is another talk in itself, unfortunately at the moment, it isn't. Okay. So another aspect of the talk, this was a road sign in Trinidad, by the way. I wanted to talk a little about what the future holds for us, or perhaps what it holds for us. As a realist, it's encouraging to me, although it might be a little depressing, that sort of mainstream publications now, articles, books, even small films, are talking about the fact that humanity is facing an existential crisis. As you might imagine, David Attenborough's book is a little more on the optimistic side. This one is pretty scary. I can't go through all of this. It's a talk by itself, but you know, we need a vast amount of reform to our political, economic, and agricultural systems. And I get frustrated when I hear people talking about Canada as a democracy. I mean, we don't even have proportional representation. The system, to me, is broken. And you think about politicians, and you know, ostensibly the most important job in society, perhaps. And what are the qualifications needed? Well, the ability to raise funds and to win a popularity contest. And the vast majority of politicians, sad to say, are environmentally illiterate. Our economic system is ecologically unsustainable. You know, we're bent almost on suicide. And the world is dominated by globalized corporate capitalism. I use the acronym GREED for this, which stands for greed, waste, and endless economic growth. And as George Monbiot, who's the foremost environmental investigative journalist in Britain, says, what mainstream economists call progress, ecologists call planetary ruin. When I think of mainstream economics, it reminds me of a quote from a book by physicist Gregory Benford. He's also a science fiction author, and he had one of his characters say, the two most abundant elements in the universe are hydrogen and stupidity. To me, that applies to our current economic system. We've also got an industrial agricultural system, and it also is unsustainable ecologically. And we've got to make the transition from animal agriculture towards plant-based food production. Even McClelland says so. So it must be true. I'd like to fire a few statistics at you from the livestock farming or animal agriculture industry. 80% of farmland worldwide is used for meat and dairy production. Now that includes the area used to grow crops that are fed to animals. Animal farming is the world's greatest cause of habitat destruction and wildlife loss. The top driver of deforestation in the world is beef production. Greenhouse gas emissions from livestock farming are greater than all the world's transport emissions combined. It's a given, really, that we have to make the move towards plant-based food production, but it would be very interesting to ask these guys their opinion about that. It's clear that the existential crisis we find ourselves in, at the heart of it lies a clash of value systems. And this cartoon for me just accurately portrays the neoliberal view of nature, which I've mentioned before. And that is that nature is basically worthless unless you can convert it into money. This advert, I almost threw up when I saw this one. I mean, it sums up corporate capitalism in a nutshell. I mean, I consume, therefore I am. And I'm harping on and on about this. I make no apology for it. Stanford University conservation biologist Paul Ehrlich, you know, he has encapsulated this perfectly. And yet it's astonishing how many people just don't get it. Well, there are loads and loads of great books out there that tell us what's wrong and what we need to do to fix things. But what we're lacking, and this is no surprise, I suppose, is a practical step-by-step how-to manual explaining how we can achieve the global revolution that is required basically to save us. So I'd like to end up with what I'm always asked and what I always used to ask presenters: what can I do? And the key thing is, you know, do something. Get stuck in, keep fighting, don't give up. I mean, it's when you're aware and you care about environmental issues, it's so easy to feel helpless and overwhelmed and depressed. I mean, I've been there, done that. I've burnt out a number of times, but we've got to stand up to the people and forces that are driving these crises. And for me, I think one of the most important things to try and do is to save as much as possible of what's left of Earth's biodiversity. I know environmentalists who suffered mental breakdowns, become clinically depressed, and even committed suicide. So the last thing I would say to you is, for goodness sake, when you're working for such important causes, is take care of yourself as well. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have.
Richard, I will repeat a question from Carolyn Campbell. Carolyn was saying that she'd had the privilege to go birding with you in Newfoundland, and she was just wondering if you see the possibility of community forestry happening in Newfoundland, and if there's any taking hold, are you encouraged at all by what might be happening there in this regard?
Well, unfortunately, I've got to admit my ignorance here. Living in the eastern hyperoceanic barrens, we've got virtually no commercial forestry happening. The main areas of logging are happening in central Newfoundland and on the west coast. And there's one pulp mill left now, which is in Corner Brook on the west coast of the island. There's a lot of logging that goes on for personal use. For actually, they chop it for firewood. So that's going on around here. But I don't know. I'm sorry, Carolyn. I haven't heard of any projects like that happening. I don't know if anybody's listening who can come in, and I don't know if Tina Leonard's listening, can come in and talk to that, but I don't know.
Richard, this is a message from, thank you for your informed presentation. Clearly, we're at a crossroads in the history of our civilization. Knowing what you know, how optimistic are you that humanity will find a way to deal with climate crisis before it's too late?
I'm sorry to say I'm not optimistic at all. I think we've passed the point of no return. We're going to, as I said, have a very hard landing. You know, if a number of these tipping points are reached, it's going to be out of control, and we're going to have a series of major positive feedbacks. So, unfortunately, the deniers have done their work. It looks grim from a climate viewpoint, I'm afraid.
Right. Richard, speaking, I certainly appreciate the words that you came to us with tonight on the population issue. It's certainly before us. It's hit the stage this week with the 8 billion point. And I'm afraid even George Monbiot, that I know you appreciate, seems to have been one who has given up as of today. Just new comments by him are quite disappointing. But anyway, that's my comment. Richard, we had an inquiry today about the book for Mistaken Point. And you know that I saw your copy of the publication. I think it was 138 pages, which was the nomination document for UNESCO World Heritage Site status. And I was very impressed with it. It's a beautiful piece of work. You are one of two authors, two geologists led the way, but there is a lot of input into that book. But I was horrified by the it not being available in any way in Newfoundland, not even at the Interpretation Center in Portugal Cove. Now, somebody emailed us today asking where they can get a copy of the book. Do you want to give a little story about that sad state of that publication?
Yeah. When we were working on the World Heritage application, the gold standard for World Heritage applications for a fossil site in Canada was Joggins Fossil Cliffs. And in 2009, a delegation of us went across to Joggins to see what they'd done. And I actually went to Quebec City, where the World Heritage Committee was meeting in 2008. And that's when Joggins got inscribed, and met the people involved. And when we went to Joggins in 2009, it was great to see that they had their equivalent document for sale. I think it was about $25 or something. I bought one at their visitor center. It was a mad scramble for us putting together the World Heritage application. Between 2008 and 2013, the government here basically ignored Mistaken Point. And then after a lot of public pressure in 2013, the government came up with the money for the application. And from then on, they wanted it done yesterday. So we managed to hit the deadline and get the application in, and everybody was totally exhausted. And a certain number of the booklets were published and were given away to various people, the participants and stuff. And it was a relatively small number. And even then we were asking, you know, this would be great to have, you know, it's such a no-brainer to have it for sale in the Interpretive Center in Portugal Cove South. But basically the money ran out, and changes, you know, some of those changes I talked about in the structure of the park service. In Newfoundland, it used to be parks and natural areas. And then just after we got World Heritage, parks and natural areas were split into two different departments. And with the ensuing, I won't call it chaos, but it just fell through the cracks, and it's extremely disappointing. I don't know if I think the company that did all the graphics and got the booklet ready for publication, I think it's still in existence, but I know they laid off a lot of people after that as well. So it's a mess. All you can do is write to the appropriate department in the government and ask. And I think you've done that, Vivian. And I think you didn't get a reply, did you?
I need to follow up, Richard, on that.
Yeah, sorry I went round the houses there with a long explanation that could have been much shorter. But yeah, it's very, very unfortunate. We get a lot of people asking for them, and it's very frustrating to say that we don't have any.
Richard, this next question is, will anything useful come out of COP27?
Well, I think Greta Thunberg said it all. You know, she didn't even bother going. And I haven't heard the latest, but I read a George Monbiot article in The Guardian today as well, and he said it was a total failure. I can't see anything happening. You know, the powers that be, the powers that are fighting tooth and nail to stop us from, you know, divesting ourselves of fossil fuels, they're still winning. So no, I think COP27 has been quite the failure, really. I don't know if you have an update whether they came to any agreement, but I mean, these agreements they come to, you know, it sounds good, but nothing ever happens, it seems.
Thanks, Richard. We also have a follow-up question. What actions would be most effective, in your opinion, in dealing with the crisis?
You mean the climate crisis? Or,
yes.
or the crisis in general? Just the climate crisis, or?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I wish I had some answers. I mean, there are a lot smarter people than me out there, and a lot of wonderful, committed people who've been working on this. And you know, they're big business, the fossil fuel industry, big agriculture. There's so many players who are making so much money from the status quo that they are so resistant to change. Whether maybe the only thing can be you know, a general people movement, but you know, can you really imagine the top 1% or the top 10%, as they call now, the polluting elite, the richest people on the planet? Can you see them voluntarily giving up their wealth and power to benefit the bulk of humanity and the biosphere? I don't see it happening voluntarily. I don't know. I think the problem with humans is we're a very visual species, and we're a flight or fight species. And so unless something is coming over the garden wall to bite us, we don't seem to react. And, you know, so many people just don't seem to get the fact that we are totally dependent on ecosystem services for our survival. And, you know, people are apathetic. They bought the propaganda. They bought the disinformation and lies. And these days, a lot of people are, you know, they're just having a hard time surviving with day to day. So I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I don't have an answer. I think we're heading for a very dystopian future. Eco-anxiety's been around for a long time. I suffer from it. But today's young people, that's where the hope lies, because they're inheriting this mess. And what's scary is that the scientists themselves say things are now happening much faster than they expected, or that the models predicted. So you know, I'm wandering here, but I've had major arguments with good friends who in the oil industry who absolutely bought oil industry propaganda about climate change, and they didn't seem to, you know, they talked about other periods in geological history where we've had, you know, very high levels of carbon dioxide. We've had hothouse Earths or greenhouse Earths. Yes, that's true, but the huge difference here is, of course, one, it's primarily human caused, and two, it's happening in geological terms incredibly fast. Nothing like this has happened before in the geological record this fast. But you know, after I had a big argument with these two friends, I thought, well, if I can't convince these two, I mean, I don't know. I wish I had answers. I don't. I'm sorry.
Well, Richard, we understand why you don't have answers. And indeed, maybe this will be the last online question or comment. It is saying, thanks very much, Richard. A very helpful presentation. And thanks to AWA for sharing it online tonight.
Well, thanks to that person too.
Lasted for 100 million years.
500 million.
Well, if I understood you correctly, the point fossils are older than Birch's shale, and I wonder whether there's are they precursors of what the organism we find at Birch's shale, or is there any connection at all?
No, the Burgess Shale fossils, as you say, are considerably younger than the Mistaken Point fossils. Here, we're just seeing the evolution of complex organisms that, as I said, are now, you know, most scientists seem to consider that they are animals. The interesting thing with the Mistaken Point fossils is that they have no mouth and they have no anus. So it's thought that they probably absorbed organic carbon through their outer walls. They were osmotrophs. They weren't filter feeders. You see none of the complexities that you see in the Burgess Shale. Again, it's thought now that, you know, you hear a lot of talk about the Cambrian explosion. It's now thought that it wasn't quite the explosion that everybody believed it to be, that it was more gradual. And what you're seeing is an artifact of, you know, these very special fossil sites where these organisms were preserved. They probably evolved considerably earlier. No, the ediacarans seem to be unique, although the Mistaken Point ediacarans are older than the ones in Australia. And the ones in Australia, you can, and in the White Sea in Russia, you can actually see that you did have mollusks developing and a worm-like organism. So things were heading the way of the Cambrian faunas, but no, it's believed that particularly with the Mistaken Point fauna, it was an evolutionary experiment that basically died out.
I think that I need to thank people, particularly Richard, for being so candid with us And I would just say that if you have any geological interests, there's nothing like Newfoundland. It's not just the fossils, it's everything about it. It's contorted, it's Iapetus ocean. It is just a fabulous place to visit. And Labrador is even more so, apparently, which I haven't been to. Anyway, thank you so much, Richard.